smile she wore while serving dinner that October evening was the same one she'd practiced in the mirror before killing her first man. And Thomas Whitmore never suspected that the gentle Mexican girl he'd purchased 3 months prior was calculating exactly how much arsenic to slip into his eldest son's coffee. Delilah moved through the Whitmore ranch house like a ghost made flesh, her bare feet silent against the wooden floors as she cleared plates from the dinner table. The family spoke around her as if she were furniture, their voices carrying the casual cruelty of men who'd never questioned their right to own another human being. Thomas Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands wrapped around a tumbler of whiskey, while his 3 sons debated the merits of expanding their cattle operation into Mexican territory. None of them noticed how carefully she listened to every word, how her dark eyes cataloged their weaknesses with the precision of a hunter studying prey. She had arrived at the Whitmore ranch on a sweltering July morning, part of a group of 23 Mexican workers that Thomas had acquired from a human trafficker operating out of El Paso. The old man had looked her over like livestock, commenting on her youth and beauty to his sons with the detached interest of a man appraising a prize horse. She was 17 then, though she'd told them she was 19, and she'd learned to keep her expression blank even as Jacob Whitmore's eyes lingered on her body with undisguised hunger. That first night, as she lay on the straw mattress in the workers' quarters, she'd pressed her face into the rough fabric and wept for the family she'd lost, for the village that no longer existed, for the girl she'd been before the Whitmores had burned everything she'd ever loved to ash and smoke. The transformation had been gradual, like watching a flower bloom in reverse. During the day, she played her role perfectly, the compliant house servant who spoke only when spoken to, who flinched appropriately when voices were raised, who accepted her circumstances with the resignation expected of her kind. She learned their routines, their preferences, their secrets whispered behind closed doors. Thomas drank himself into a stupor every night, haunted by dreams of a war that had ended 20 years ago. His eldest son, Marcus, was slowly going blind from syphilis contracted in the brothels of San Antonio, though he hid it well behind expensive spectacles. Jacob, the middle son, beat his horse until it bled and would do the same to any woman who crossed him. And Samuel, the youngest at 19, possessed a streak of cruelty that made even his brothers uncomfortable, delighting in the torture of small animals and the systematic humiliation of anyone weaker than himself. But when darkness fell and the ranch settled into sleep, Delilah became someone else entirely. She would slip from her quarters like smoke, moving through shadows to observe, to learn, to plan. She'd grown up in these borderlands, raised by a grandmother who knew the old ways, who'd taught her which plants could heal and which could kill. The desert provided everything she needed: loco weed to drive horses mad, oleander to stop a heart, deathcap mushrooms that mimicked the symptoms of dysentery. She gathered them by moonlight, dried them in secret places, and waited for the perfect opportunity to begin her work. The opportunity had presented itself 6 weeks ago, when Jacob cornered her in the barn, his intentions written clearly across his flushed face. She'd submitted without resistance, let him take what he wanted while she stared at the rafters above and planned exactly how he would die. The irony wasn't lost on her that his violation had given her the access she needed to the main house, as Thomas decreed she should work as a house servant to keep her available for his son's appetites. Jacob's desire had opened the door to his family's destruction, and she'd walked through it with a smile. Now, 3 months after her arrival, she was no longer the broken girl who'd been sold like cattle. She'd become something harder, sharper, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by an unquenchable thirst for justice. The Whitmores had no idea that the quiet Mexican girl who poured their coffee and cleaned their floors was the sole survivor of the village they'd destroyed in their quest for land and cattle. They didn't know that she'd watched her parents burn alive, that she'd hidden in a root cellar while they murdered every soul she'd ever loved. They saw only what she wanted them to see: a broken thing to be used and discarded. Marcus pushed back from the table, announcing his intention to retire early, and Delilah moved to clear his cup. The white powder she'd mixed into his coffee had been tasteless, odorless, invisible against the dark liquid. Arsenic worked slowly, mimicking the symptoms of many common ailments, and by the time they realized what was happening, it would be far too late. She'd learned patience these past months, learned that revenge was a dish best served with careful planning and meticulous execution. As she carried the dishes to the kitchen, she could hear Samuel describing his plans to break in a new Mustang, his voice bright with anticipated cruelty. He spoke of the animal as if it were already defeated, already broken to his will, just as he spoke of the Mexican workers, just as he'd spoken of her village before they'd reduced it to smoking ruins. The youngest Whitmore son had inherited his father's capacity for violence, but lacked the restraint that came with age and experience. He would be next, after Marcus, and his death would be far less gentle than arsenic poisoning. Thomas called for more whiskey, and she hurried to comply, keeping her eyes downcast as she refilled his glass. The old man's hand brushed against hers as she poured, a casual reminder of his ownership, and she forced herself not to recoil. Soon, she told herself. Soon they would all understand what they had taken from her, what their greed and cruelty had cost. Soon they would know exactly who she was and why she'd come to them wearing the mask of servitude. The clock on the mantel chimed 10 o'clock, and she knew that within hours Marcus would begin to feel the first symptoms: nausea, stomach cramps, the beginning of his slow slide toward death. By morning, the eldest Whitmore son would be writhing in agony. And still his family wouldn't suspect the quiet Mexican girl who'd served him his final meal. As she prepared to withdraw to her quarters, Delilah allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction. The first thread in the tapestry of her revenge had been pulled, and soon the entire structure would begin to unravel, taking the Whitmore family down with it into the darkness they'd earned through their sins. She would watch them fall, one by one, and when the last of them drew his final breath, she would finally be able to rest. The girl they'd purchased would be their death, delivered with the same smile she wore now as she bid them good night and disappeared into the shadows from whence she'd come. The screaming began at dawn, piercing the morning stillness like a blade drawn across stone, and Delilah felt a flutter of dark satisfaction bloom in her chest as she listened to Marcus Whitmore's agony echo through the ranch house walls. She moved through her morning routine with practiced calm, building the fire in the kitchen stove and preparing breakfast while the eldest son's cries of pain provided a symphony for her work. The other men had gathered in his room, their voices tight with confusion and fear as they tried to understand what was wrong with him. Thomas barked orders at Jacob to ride for the doctor in town, while Samuel's higher-pitched voice suggested they force Marcus to drink whiskey to ease his suffering. None of them suspected poison, not yet, and Delilah intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. She climbed the stairs with a tray of coffee and biscuits, her face carefully arranged in an expression of concern as she knocked softly on Marcus's door. Thomas opened it, his weathered features drawn with worry, and she could see past him to where Marcus writhed on his bed, clutching his stomach while sweat poured down his face in rivers. The arsenic was working exactly as she'd expected, mimicking the violent symptoms of dysentery or food poisoning, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling at the sight of his suffering. Thomas accepted the tray with distracted gratitude, and she caught a glimpse of Jacob pacing by the window, his own face pale with something that might have been guilt. He'd eaten the same meal as his brother the night before, consumed the same food prepared by the same hands. And she could see the fear creeping into his eyes as he wondered if he might be next. The thought sent a warm thrill through her veins, knowing that his paranoia would only grow stronger as the days passed and Marcus's condition worsened. She withdrew to the kitchen and began preparing poultices and herbal teas, playing the role of the concerned servant offering folk remedies to help the suffering young master. The tea she brewed contained chamomile and mint to mask the bitter taste of the oleander she'd ground into powder and hidden in a small cloth packet sewn into her skirt. When Thomas came downstairs an hour later, desperate for anything that might ease his son's pain, she offered the tea with downcast eyes and a voice soft with manufactured sympathy. The doctor arrived near midday, a thin man with nervous hands who examined Marcus with growing bewilderment. She hovered at the edges of the room, refilling water basins and changing sweat-soaked linens while listening to his muttered theories about bad food or contaminated water. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and bed rest, assuring Thomas that these ailments often passed within a few days if the patient could keep down fluids. Delilah nodded along with his recommendations, even as she mentally calculated how much longer the arsenic would take to finish its work. As the day wore on, she noticed how the family's dynamic began to shift under the pressure of crisis. Samuel grew increasingly agitated, unable to sit still or focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. He kept asking when Marcus would get better, when things would return to normal. His youthful face twisted with an anxiety that aged him beyond his 19 years. Jacob, meanwhile, had grown suspicious of everything, refusing to eat anything that hadn't been prepared in front of him and watching her with new wariness whenever she entered a room. The poison she'd fed them might be killing Marcus, but it was also eating away at their sense of security, their comfortable assumption that they were untouchable in their own domain. Thomas aged a decade in a single day, the burden of his son's mysterious illness weighing on his shoulders like a millstone. She watched him move through the house like a ghost, checking on Marcus every few minutes and questioning the doctor repeatedly about possible causes and cures. His drinking increased dramatically, and by evening he was consuming whiskey with the desperate intensity of a man trying to drown his fears. She saw opportunity in his distraction, in the way grief and worry had made him careless about his usual precautions. That night, she waited until the house settled into an uneasy quiet before making her move. Marcus's ragged breathing could be heard through the walls, punctuated by occasional moans of pain that seemed to echo through every room. She slipped from her quarters and made her way to Thomas's study, where he kept his important papers and the steel lockbox containing the family's money. The lock was simple enough to pick with a hairpin, a skill her grandmother had taught her along with herb lore and the reading of signs in nature. Inside the box, she found exactly what she'd hoped for: letters detailing the family's business dealings, including correspondence with the Mexican land grabbers who'd helped them acquire territory south of the border. Her fingers trembled as she read her own village's name in Thomas's careful script, described as a minor obstacle to be removed through whatever means necessary. The letter was dated 3 days before the attack that had destroyed everything she'd ever known, confirming what she'd always suspected about the Whitmore's role in the massacre. She photographed the letters in her memory, studying every detail before replacing them exactly as she'd found them. The evidence would be useful eventually, but for now, she had more immediate concerns. From another compartment in the box, she retrieved a small leather pouch containing gold coins, payment from their Mexican partners for services rendered. She took only a few pieces, enough to fund her plans, but not enough to be missed immediately, and slipped the pouch back into place. As she prepared to leave, she heard footsteps in the hallway above and froze, listening intently as someone moved around on the second floor. Jacob's voice drifted down, speaking in low tones to someone, probably Samuel, and she caught fragments of conversation about posting guards and checking the food more carefully. They were beginning to suspect sabotage, though they hadn't yet connected it to her specifically. The paranoia was spreading like a disease, turning them against each other and making them question everything they'd previously taken for granted. She made her way back to her quarters through the shadows, her mind already working on the next phase of her plan. Marcus would be dead within days, and then she would need to decide how to proceed with Jacob. The middle son was growing increasingly suspicious, but his caution might actually work in her favor if she could find a way to use it against him. Samuel remained oblivious to the danger, but his youth and impulsiveness made him unpredictable, potentially dangerous if he stumbled onto the truth too early. The gold coins felt heavy in her pocket as she settled onto her straw mattress, a tangible reminder of the price the Whitmores had paid for her family's destruction. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities. New chances to tighten the noose around their necks while maintaining her facade of innocent servitude. Marcus's suffering was only the beginning, a single note in the symphony of vengeance she intended to compose before her work was finished. As she closed her eyes and listened to the distant sounds of pain echoing through the house, Delilah smiled in the darkness and began planning exactly how Jacob Whitmore would meet his end. Marcus died on the third morning, his body finally surrendering to the poison that had been burning through his system like acid. And Delilah stood in the kitchen kneading bread dough while his death rattle filled the house with its terrible music. The sound of Thomas's anguished cry echoed through the walls as he discovered his eldest son's lifeless form, and she could hear Jacob's boots pounding against the floor as he ran to see for himself what had happened. Samuel's voice joined the chorus of grief, high and panicked, as he called for the doctor who had been sleeping in the guest room, waiting for this inevitable moment. She continued her work methodically, pressing and folding the dough with steady hands, while chaos erupted around her, her face arranged in an expression of solemn concern that would be expected from a servant witnessing such tragedy. When Thomas stumbled into the kitchen an hour later, his eyes red-rimmed and his clothes disheveled from sitting vigil beside his son's corpse, she was ready with coffee and words of comfort delivered in broken English that emphasized her supposed simplicity. She watched him struggle to comprehend how a healthy 25-year-old man could waste away and die in less than 4 days, saw the way his hands shook as he tried to light his pipe, and felt a cold satisfaction settle in her bones like winter frost. The patriarch's world was beginning to crumble, just as hers had crumbled under the weight of his greed and violence. The doctor pronounced the cause of death as severe dysentery, possibly complicated by some form of intestinal ailment that had proven resistant to treatment. He spoke with the confidence of a man eager to avoid admitting his own limitations, suggesting that such sudden illnesses sometimes struck young men who had lived too hard and indulged too freely in the pleasures of frontier life. Thomas accepted this explanation with the desperate gratitude of a father seeking any reason for his loss that didn't involve his own failures, while Jacob stood silent in the corner, his face a mask of barely controlled suspicion. That afternoon, as the family made preparations for Marcus's burial, Jacob cornered her in the pantry where she was counting supplies for the funeral meal. His eyes had taken on a wild quality that reminded her of a horse scenting smoke on the wind, and she could see that the middle son's paranoia had grown into something approaching madness. He asked her questions in rapid Spanish, testing her responses, watching her face for any sign of deception or guilt. She answered in the halting manner of someone whose education had been limited to practical matters, mixing in words from her grandmother's indigenous dialect to further convince him that she was nothing more than an ignorant peasant girl caught up in circumstances beyond her understanding. But even as she maintained her facade, she could see that Jacob's suspicions were crystallizing into something dangerous. He spoke of posting guards around the food stores, of having everything tested before consumption, of restricting access to the family's meals to only the most trusted servants. His fear was making him careful, but it was also making him cruel, and she watched him strike one of the Mexican workers for moving too slowly, saw the way his hand lingered near his gun whenever she entered a room. The middle son was becoming a problem that would need to be addressed sooner rather than later. Samuel, meanwhile, had retreated into a shell of grief and confusion that made him even more unpredictable than usual. She found him in the barn that evening, sitting in the hay and staring at nothing while tears streamed down his young face. For a moment, seeing him there in his vulnerability, she almost felt something like pity for the boy who had grown up in a house where violence was currency and cruelty was strength. Then she remembered the way he'd laughed while describing her village's destruction, the bright anticipation in his voice as he'd planned the torture of captured survivors. And the momentary softness in her heart hardened back into iron resolve. The funeral took place on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a preacher riding in from town to speak words over Marcus's pine coffin that seemed to echo hollow in the desert air. Thomas wept openly, his grief raw and unashamed, while Jacob stood rigid as a fence post and Samuel swayed like a sapling in a strong wind. She remained at the edge of the gathering with the other servants, her head bowed in apparent prayer, while her eyes catalogued the weaknesses that sorrow had opened in her enemy's defenses. After the burial, the family descended into a strange twilight existence where normal routines became suspect and every meal was a potential threat. Jacob took to preparing his own food, cooking simple dishes over a small fire he built outside rather than trusting anything that came from the kitchen. Samuel ate sparingly and with obvious fear, pushing food around his plate while watching everyone else for signs of illness. Thomas drank more heavily than ever, using whiskey to numb both his grief and his growing paranoia about what had really killed his eldest son. The changed atmosphere in the house created new opportunities, even as it presented new challenges. She had to be more careful about her movements, more subtle in her approach, but the family's fractured state also made them vulnerable in ways they hadn't been before. Jacob's isolation from the others meant he could be dealt with privately, without witnesses to complicate her plans. Samuel's emotional instability made him susceptible to manipulation if she could find the right pressure points to exploit. And Thomas's drinking provided windows of opportunity when his guard was down and his judgment compromised. 3 days after the funeral, she made her move against Jacob. She had observed his new routine carefully, noting that he went to the barn each evening around sunset to check on his horse and avoid the tension-filled atmosphere of the house. She waited until he was alone with the animals, then approached him with a basket of grain and an expression of innocent helpfulness. He was immediately suspicious, demanding to know why she was there and what she wanted. But she played her role perfectly, the simple servant girl trying to help with the livestock as she'd been ordered to do. She had soaked the grain in water infused with jimsonweed, a plant that grew wild in the arroyos and produced powerful hallucinations in sufficient doses. When Jacob wasn't looking, she scattered the tainted grain in his horse's feed trough, then withdrew to watch from the shadows as the animal began to consume its poisoned meal. The effects would take time to manifest, but when they did, the horse would become a weapon more deadly than any gun or knife. An hour later, as purple shadows began to creep across the desert landscape, Jacob's screams shattered the evening quiet. She ran toward the barn with the others, maintaining her facade of concern while her heart sang with satisfaction at the sounds of chaos erupting from within. They found Jacob's broken body trampled into the hay and horse manure, his ribs crushed and his skull cracked open like an egg by the hooves of his maddened mount. The horse itself stood in the corner, eyes rolled back and foam dripping from its mouth as the jimsonweed worked its poisonous magic through its nervous system. Thomas put the animal down with a single shot, his face gray with shock and grief as he knelt beside his second son's corpse. Samuel vomited into the hay, his young mind unable to process the sudden violence that had stolen another member of his family. And Delilah stood among the servants, her eyes wide with manufactured horror, while inside she felt only the cold satisfaction of another debt paid in full. 2 sons down, she thought, as they carried Jacob's body toward the house. 1 son and 1 father left to go. The paranoia that consumed the Whitmore ranch after Jacob's death was a living thing, feeding on fear and growing stronger with each passing day. And Delilah moved through its shadows like a spider tending her web, while the 2 remaining men slowly destroyed themselves with suspicion and grief. Thomas had aged 20 years in the 2 weeks since losing his second son, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a broken old man who jumped at shadows and saw enemies in every corner. He barely slept anymore, spending his nights drinking whiskey and staring at the walls while his mind conjured threats that existed everywhere and nowhere. The ranch hands whispered among themselves about his increasing erratic behavior, the way he would suddenly order them to check locks that had already been checked, count cattle that had been counted hours before, search buildings for intruders that existed only in his tortured imagination. Samuel had responded to his brother's violent death by retreating even further into himself speaking only when directly addressed, and even then in monosyllables that revealed nothing of his inner state. She watched him during meals, noting how his hands trembled when he lifted his fork, how his eyes darted constantly toward the windows as if expecting death to come crashing through the glass at any moment. The youngest Whitmore son was teetering on the edge of complete mental collapse, and she knew that with the right pressure applied at the right moment, she could push him over that precipice into the abyss that waited below. The opportunity to tighten her web around both remaining targets presented itself when a letter arrived from their business partners in Mexico, delivered by a nervous-looking courier who clearly wanted to complete his mission and escape as quickly as possible. She was serving breakfast when Thomas read the message, and she could see his face pale as he absorbed whatever news it contained. His hands shook as he folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket. And when Samuel asked what the letter said, his father's only response was a sharp command to finish his eggs and speak no more of it. Later that morning, while cleaning Thomas's study, she managed to glimpse the letter lying open on his desk. The Mexican partners were growing impatient with delays in their land acquisition scheme, demanding explanations for why certain properties hadn't been secured as promised. They mentioned specific villages that were still resisting their expansion efforts. And her blood turned to ice as she read familiar names, places where people she had known still lived and worked. The Whitmore's appetite for destruction hadn't been satisfied by the annihilation of her home. They were planning to devour other communities as well, to spread their cancer across the borderlands until nothing remained but ash and profit. The revelation filled her with a rage so pure and overwhelming that she had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from falling. She had thought her vendetta was personal, a matter of balancing the scales for her own losses. But now she understood that her family's murder had been just the beginning of a much larger campaign of terror. Every moment she delayed meant more innocent people would suffer the same fate that had befallen her parents, her siblings, her friends. The game she was playing had stakes far higher than she had realized, and the urgency of completing her mission pressed against her like a physical weight. That afternoon, she began implementing the next phase of her plan with a methodical precision that would have impressed her grandmother. The old woman had taught her that the most effective poisons were often the ones that mimicked natural causes, and she had spent weeks studying the patterns of Thomas's drinking to determine exactly how to exploit his weakness. The whiskey he consumed each night came from a special bottle he kept locked in his desk drawer, an expensive bourbon that he claimed was the only thing that could ease the pain of his losses. She had observed him unlock the drawer dozens of times, memorizing the precise movements needed to work the simple mechanism, and now she used that knowledge to gain access to his private supply. The bottle was half empty, which made her task easier. She could replace a portion of the whiskey with her own carefully prepared mixture without significantly altering the liquid's appearance or aroma. The concoction she had brewed contained extracts from several desert plants, including angel's trumpet and castor beans, combined in proportions that would produce a slow but inevitable poisoning that would appear to be the result of liver failure brought on by excessive drinking. As she worked, carefully measuring and mixing her deadly cocktail, she allowed herself to imagine Thomas's final moments. He would die as he had lived, selfishly and without honor, his body failing him just as his soul had failed humanity. But his death would be slow enough for him to understand what was happening, to realize that his sins had finally caught up with him, to experience the same helpless terror that her family had felt as flames consumed their world. With Thomas's poison prepared and administered, she turned her attention to Samuel. The youngest son represented a different kind of challenge, his youth and relative innocence making him both more difficult to hate and more dangerous to underestimate. She had seen flashes of his father's cruelty in his treatment of animals and servants, but she had also witnessed moments of genuine confusion and remorse that suggested his capacity for evil might not yet be fully developed. The question was whether she could afford to show mercy to someone who carried the Whitmore blood, someone who might grow up to perpetuate the cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives. The answer came to her as she watched Samuel sitting alone in the parlor, staring at a daguerreotype of his dead brothers with tears streaming down his young face. His grief appeared genuine, his anguish real, but she forced herself to remember that crocodiles could weep while devouring their prey. The Whitmore legacy was poison, and every member of the family was infected with its corruption. Allowing Samuel to live would be like leaving a viper's egg unbroken. Eventually it would hatch, and the serpent within would strike. She began laying the groundwork for his destruction by planting seeds of doubt about his father's sanity, mentioning in carefully casual conversation with other servants how worried she was about Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior. She described incidents that were real but exaggerated their severity, creating a narrative of a man slowly losing his grip on reality under the weight of grief and guilt. When Samuel overheard these conversations, as she intended him to, she could see the fear growing in his eyes as he began to question whether his father might be becoming dangerous. The psychological pressure was having its intended effect, driving Samuel deeper into isolation and despair, while simultaneously undermining his trust in the only family member he had left. She watched him begin to avoid his father, eating meals separately and sleeping with a chair wedged against his bedroom door. The youngest Whitmore was becoming paranoid about his own father's potential violence, never suspecting that the real threat was the quiet Mexican girl who served his meals and cleaned his room. As the days passed and Thomas's health began to deteriorate from the slow-acting poison, the atmosphere in the ranch house grew increasingly toxic. Father and son barely spoke to each other, communicating only through servants and spending their days in separate parts of the house like two wild animals sharing the same cage. She moved between them like a messenger of doom, carefully stoking their mutual suspicions while maintaining her facade of loyal service. The web was nearly complete now, with both remaining Whitmores trapped in its silken strands and slowly being drawn toward the center where death waited with infinite patience. She had become the spider, the predator, the instrument of justice that would finally balance the scales for all the innocent blood that had been spilled in service of their greed. Soon, very soon, the last act of her terrible play would begin, and when the curtain fell, the Whitmore name would be nothing but a memory carved on weathered tombstones in the desert wind. The letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in November carried the seal of the territorial marshal, and as Thomas read its contents with shaking hands, Delilah could see 20 years of carefully buried secrets rising from their graves to demand payment for sins he thought had been forgotten. She was polishing silver in the dining room when Thomas burst through the front door. His face ashen and his breathing labored as if he had run all the way from town. The whiskey she had been feeding him for weeks was taking its toll, making his movements unsteady and his thinking unclear, but the fear in his eyes was sharp and focused as he clutched the official document to his chest. Samuel emerged from the kitchen where he had been picking at his breakfast, and she watched father and son regard each other with the wariness of strangers who shared only blood and guilt. Thomas spread the letter on the dining table with trembling fingers, and she caught fragments of its contents as she moved closer under the pretense of dusting nearby furniture. The territorial government was launching an investigation into illegal land acquisitions along the Mexican border, prompted by reports from survivors of various massacres who had finally found their voices and demanded justice. Several names were mentioned specifically, including members of her own village who had apparently escaped the slaughter and made their way to officials who were willing to listen to tales of murder and theft committed in the name of manifest destiny. The color drained from Samuel's face as he read over his father's shoulder, and she could see the precise moment when the youngest Whitmore son understood the true scope of his family's crimes. He had been 15 when the attacks began, old enough to participate, but young enough to believe the lies his father had told about defending their land from Mexican raiders. Now, confronted with official recognition of what they had actually done, his carefully constructed narrative of justified violence crumbled like sand in a windstorm. Thomas's response was immediate and desperate. He began gathering papers from his desk, feeding them to the fire in the hearth while muttering about evidence and witnesses who needed to be silenced before they could testify. Samuel stood frozen in the center of the room, his young face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension as he watched his father destroy records that documented years of coordinated brutality. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, asking questions about specific raids that Thomas answered with increasingly frantic explanations about necessary actions and unfortunate casualties. She listened to their conversation with growing satisfaction as father and son revealed details about the systematic campaign of terror that had destroyed not just her village, but dozens of others throughout the borderlands. Thomas spoke of meetings with Mexican officials who had been paid to look the other way, of agreements with local bandits who served as proxies for attacks that needed to appear random and unconnected. Samuel's questions grew more pointed and horrified as he learned about the torture of prisoners, the deliberate targeting of women and children, the calculated cruelty that had been employed to ensure no one would survive to identify the true perpetrators. The poison she had been administering was affecting Thomas more severely now, and she could see him struggling to think clearly as the toxic compounds interfered with his brain function. His explanations became increasingly disjointed and defensive, jumping from topic to topic without logical connection. And Samuel began to look at his father with something approaching revulsion as the full extent of the family's sins became clear. The youngest son's illusions about his heritage were dying in real time, replaced by a crushing awareness of the blood that stained his hands and name. As the morning wore on and more details emerged, Thomas began to fixate on the idea that someone had betrayed them, someone who knew intimate details about their operations and had provided information to the territorial authorities. His paranoid gaze swept around the room, settling on various servants with wild accusations before moving on to the next target. He questioned the loyalty of ranch hands, the discretion of business associates, even the trustworthiness of family friends who might have overheard sensitive conversations. Samuel watched his father's mental deterioration with growing alarm, but neither man suspected the quiet Mexican girl who continued her work around them while absorbing every word of their incriminating discussion. The breakthrough came when Thomas, in his poisoned delirium, began ranting about the Mexican workers they had acquired over the years, wondering aloud if any of them might have connections to the destroyed villages. He pulled out a ledger documenting their human acquisitions, reading names and dates while trying to establish patterns that might reveal a spy in their midst. Samuel listened with increasing unease as his father described the various groups of workers they had purchased, the locations where they had been acquired, the circumstances that had made them available for sale. When Thomas reached the entry for her own group, reading the details of their acquisition from El Paso in July, something in his voice changed. He spoke the name of her village slowly, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to make a connection that suddenly seemed important. She could see the wheels turning in his damaged brain as he tried to remember why that particular name seemed familiar, why it resonated with something he had done or planned to do. Samuel moved closer to read the ledger over his father's shoulder, and she saw recognition dawn in his eyes as he made the connection between the village name and one of their recent raids. The moment of revelation was electric, crackling with tension as father and son suddenly understood that they had brought their own destruction into their home. Thomas's head snapped up to stare at her with wild eyes, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process the implications of what he had discovered. Samuel took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip, and she knew that her careful masquerade was finally coming to an end. Instead of fear, she felt only a profound sense of relief as she allowed her true self to emerge from behind the mask of servitude she had worn for so many months. The smile that spread across her face was not the submissive expression of a broken servant, but the predatory grin of a hunter who had successfully stalked her prey to their lair. She straightened to her full height, letting them see the intelligence and determination that had been hidden beneath layers of careful deception, and spoke in perfect English for the first time since her arrival. She told them who she was, who her family had been, what the Whitmores had taken from her on that burning night when innocents died screaming in the desert darkness. She described watching her parents burn alive, hiding in terror while soldiers with Whitmore brands on their equipment systematically murdered everyone she had ever loved. The words poured out of her like water through a broken dam, carrying with them months of suppressed rage and grief that had been fermenting in the darkness of her soul. Thomas tried to reach for his gun. But the poison had made his movements slow and clumsy, and Samuel was too shocked by the revelations to react quickly enough to prevent what happened next. She had been preparing for this moment since the day she arrived, and her own weapon was already in her hand before either man could draw their firearms. The derringer her grandmother had given her was small but deadly at close range, and she held it steady as she continued speaking, telling them exactly how she had killed Marcus with arsenic, how she had driven Jacob's horse mad with Jimson weed, how she had been slowly poisoning Thomas himself for weeks. The truth hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, and she could see the exact moment when both men understood that they were already dead, that their fate had been sealed the moment they chose to profit from the destruction of innocent lives. Samuel began to weep. Whether from fear or guilt she could not tell, while Thomas simply stared at her with the broken expression of a man who had finally met justice in a form he could not bribe, threaten, or destroy. The gunshot that shattered the morning stillness was not the one Delilah had planned to fire, and as Samuel Whitmore's body crumpled to the floor with blood spreading from the hole in his chest, she realized that some forms of justice demanded prices she had never expected to pay. Thomas stood over his son's corpse with the smoking pistol still clutched in his trembling hand, his poison-clouded mind having reached the conclusion that killing Samuel was preferable to watching him face trial and execution for the family's crimes. The old man's logic was twisted but comprehensible. Better to end the boy's life quickly than allow him to suffer the prolonged agony of public disgrace and judicial punishment. Samuel had been weeping, begging for forgiveness from the ghosts of the innocent dead, and his father had silenced those pleas with a single bullet to the heart. She stared at the spreading pool of blood with something approaching disappointment, realizing that Samuel's death had been stolen from her by a father's warped sense of mercy. The youngest Whitmore had been meant to suffer as her family had suffered, to experience the full weight of his sins before paying the ultimate price for his participation in their campaign of terror. Instead, he had died quickly and cleanly, spared the prolonged torment she had planned for him through her grandmother's more creative applications of desert botany. Thomas turned the gun toward her, with movements made slow and uncertain by the accumulated effects of the poison she had been feeding him for weeks. His hands shook violently as he tried to aim, the toxic compounds having disrupted his nervous system to the point where fine motor control was nearly impossible. She could have easily taken the weapon from him or killed him before he could fire. But something in his eyes stopped her, a look of such profound brokenness that she found herself curious to hear what final words he might offer before joining his sons in death. The confession that poured from his lips was more complete than anything she could have forced from him through torture or interrogation. He spoke of the corruption that had infected his soul during the war, of the way violence had become a drug that demanded ever-increasing doses to satisfy his addiction. He described the gradual escalation from legitimate military actions to the wholesale slaughter of civilians. The moment when he had crossed the line from soldier to murderer and found that he liked the feeling of absolute power over life and death. The business partnership with Mexican officials had been his idea, a way to continue the killing while generating profit that could justify the bloodshed to anyone who asked uncomfortable questions. Each village destroyed meant new land for cattle, new opportunities for expansion, new excuses to indulge his appetite for violence under the banner of economic development. He had told himself that he was building something worthwhile, creating prosperity from chaos, but now he could see that he had been nothing more than a parasite feeding on innocent blood. His sons had been infected with his sickness from childhood, raised to see violence as a solution to every problem and cruelty as a sign of strength. Marcus had been the most enthusiastic participant in their raids, delighting in the systematic torture of prisoners and the desecration of sacred places. Jacob had served as the tactical mind behind their operations, planning attacks with the cold precision of a professional soldier. Even Samuel, despite his youth, had proven capable of atrocities that would have shamed hardened criminals, his innocence corrupted by a father who had taught him that might made right. As Thomas spoke, his voice grew weaker and his words more slurred, the poison finally overwhelming his system's ability to function. She could see death approaching in the gray pallor of his skin, the labored rhythm of his breathing, the way his eyes struggled to maintain focus on her face. The gun in his hand wavered and dropped to his side as his strength finally failed him. And she knew that his time was measured in minutes rather than hours. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his rambling confession, and she moved to the window to see a group of riders approaching the ranch house at a gallop. The badges on their vests marked them as territorial marshals, and she recognized the lead rider as the same man whose signature had been on the letter that morning. They had come to arrest the Whitmores for their crimes, but they would find only corpses and the instrument of their destruction waiting to face whatever justice the law demanded. Thomas followed her gaze and saw the approaching lawman, and his face contorted with something that might have been relief or regret. He spoke one final time, his voice barely audible as the poison completed its work, asking for forgiveness that she had no power to grant and expressing remorse that came far too late to matter. Then he collapsed to the floor beside his son's body, the pistol falling from his lifeless fingers to lie among the papers he had tried to burn that morning. She stood alone in the dining room surrounded by the debris of her successful campaign, feeling strangely empty now that her long-sought vengeance was finally complete. The Whitmore family was extinct, their legacy of violence ended forever, but the satisfaction she had expected to feel was tempered by an awareness of what her actions would cost her. The marshals would find her here with the bodies, and while she had no regrets about what she had done, she knew that the territorial justice system would not recognize the legitimacy of her private war against those who had destroyed her world. The front door burst open as the lawmen entered with weapons drawn, their voices calling for everyone in the house to show themselves with hands visible. She walked slowly toward them with her arms raised, the derringer left behind on the dining table as evidence of her guilt. The lead marshal, a grizzled man with kind eyes and a gray mustache, looked from her to the bodies with an expression of grim understanding, as if he had seen enough frontier justice to recognize its aftermath when he encountered it. They placed her in shackles with a gentleness that surprised her, treating her more like a material witness than a dangerous criminal, despite the obvious evidence of her involvement in the deaths. The marshal asked careful questions about what had happened, and she answered with complete honesty, describing her infiltration of the ranch and her systematic elimination of the family members responsible for her village's destruction. She showed them the evidence she had gathered of the Whitmore's crimes, the correspondence that documented their partnership in systematic murder, the financial records that proved their profit from genocide. As they prepared to transport her to town for trial, she took one final look at the ranch house that had been both her prison and her weapon for the past 4 months. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of red and gold that reminded her of the burning ruins of her childhood home. Soon this place would be abandoned, left to the wind and sand and the gradual erosion that claimed all human works in the borderlands. The Whitmore legacy would crumble into dust, forgotten by history except as a cautionary tale about the price of unchecked cruelty. But her own story was far from over, and as the marshals helped her into the wagon that would carry her toward whatever fate awaited, Delilah found herself smiling at the irony of her situation. She had come to the ranch as property, purchased like livestock, and expected to submit to her owner's will. Now she was leaving as something else entirely, a force of nature, an agent of justice. A reminder that even the most powerless could find ways to balance the scales when the law failed to protect the innocent. The wagon wheels began to turn, carrying her away from the scene of her triumph toward an uncertain future, and she settled back against the wooden seat with the satisfaction of a job completed and a promise kept to the dead who had demanded vengeance. The trial of Delilah Morales lasted 3 days in the dusty courthouse of a town that had grown rich from the blood money of murdered Mexican villages, and as she stood before the judge who would decide her fate, she wore the same serene smile that had carried her through 4 months of careful killing. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderess who had used deception and poison to slaughter an entire family, presenting evidence of her systematic campaign against the Whitmores with the outraged indignation of men who had profited from the same violence they now condemned. They spoke of Marcus's agony, of Jacob's brutal death, of Thomas and Samuel's final moments, as if these men had been innocent victims rather than architects of genocide. The territorial prosecutor, a thin man with nervous hands who had taken Whitmore money for years, demanded the death penalty with a vehemence that suggested personal stakes in seeing her silenced forever. But the defense that emerged was not one she had expected, built not on denials of her guilt, but on revelations that turned the courtroom into a chamber of horrors as witness after witness testified to the true scope of the Whitmore legacy. Survivors from dozens of destroyed villages came forward to tell their stories, speaking of family members burned alive and children murdered in their beds while houses blazed around them. Mexican officials who had refused Whitmore bribes described systematic campaigns of terror designed to clear land for cattle and profit. Even some of the ranch hands who had participated in the raids came forward to confess their parts in atrocities that had haunted their dreams for years. The evidence she had gathered from Thomas's files proved devastating when presented in court, documenting a conspiracy that stretched across hundreds of miles and involved dozens of accomplices in both Mexico and the territorial government. Letters detailing planned massacres were read aloud to a courtroom that grew increasingly silent as the full scope of the Whitmore's crimes became clear. Financial records showed payments to Mexican bandits, bribes to officials, and profits from land stolen with innocent blood. The prosecution's narrative of unprovoked murder crumbled under the weight of documented genocide that had claimed over 2,000 lives in pursuit of profit. The judge, a weathered man named Harrison who had served on the frontier for 20 years, listened to the testimony with an expression that grew grimmer with each revelation. She could see him struggling with the legal precedent her case would set, weighing the letter of the law against the spirit of justice that had motivated her actions. The courtroom was packed with survivors and supporters who saw her not as a criminal, but as an instrument of divine retribution, their faces reflecting a hunger for justice that the official legal system had never been willing to provide. When called to testify in her own defense, she spoke with calm clarity about the night her world had ended, describing in careful detail how she had watched her family burn while Whitmore-branded soldiers systematically murdered everyone she had ever loved. She told the court about her months of planning, her infiltration of the ranch, her patient work to document the family's crimes while simultaneously destroying them one by one. She expressed no remorse for her actions, no regret for the deaths she had caused. Only satisfaction that justice had finally been served to those who had escaped punishment for far too long. The testimony that broke the courtroom's composure came from an unexpected source, a former territorial marshal named Webb who had been investigating Whitmore activities for years before being forced into retirement by political pressure. He described a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, implicating judges and prosecutors and governors in a systematic cover-up designed to protect profitable relationships with Mexican partners. The current prosecutor's face went white as Webb read from documents that showed regular payments from Whitmore accounts to territorial officials, including the very judge who had originally refused to investigate reports of the massacres. Judge Harrison declared a recess that lasted 2 hours while he studied the evidence and considered the implications of a case that had exploded far beyond a simple murder trial. When court reconvened, his demeanor had changed from judicial restraint to something approaching revolutionary fervor as he addressed the packed courtroom with words that would be quoted in newspapers from Texas to California. He spoke of justice denied and corruption exposed, of the need for moral courage in the face of institutional failure, of the difference between legal technicalities and fundamental human rights. The verdict, when it came, was both expected and shocking in its implications. Guilty of murder in the first degree, but with the recommendation that the sentence be commuted in recognition of extraordinary circumstances that had left the defendant with no recourse through legal channels. The judge's lengthy explanation of his reasoning became a manifesto against the corruption that had allowed monsters like the Whitmores to operate with impunity for decades, and his words sparked investigations that would eventually reach into territorial capitals and Mexican state houses. But the sentence itself was death by hanging, carried out immediately to prevent political interference from officials who had been implicated in the broader conspiracy. The crowd that gathered outside the courthouse that morning included hundreds of survivors from destroyed villages, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief for her fate and gratitude for the justice she had delivered. Mexican and Anglo settlers stood together in unprecedented solidarity, united by their shared recognition that she had accomplished what their respective governments had been unwilling or unable to do. As they fitted the noose around her neck on the gallows platform erected in the town square, she looked out over the assembled crowd and saw faces that reflected her own story. People who had lost everything to greed and violence, who had been failed by systems that should have protected them, who understood that sometimes justice required actions that the law could not sanction. Children who had lost parents, wives who had lost husbands. Entire communities that had been scattered to the winds by men who saw human life as an obstacle to profit. The priest who offered her last rites was a young Mexican man whose own village had been destroyed by Whitmore raiders, and his words of absolution carried personal understanding of the path that had brought her to this moment. She declined his offer to hear confession, explaining that she had nothing to confess. Every action she had taken had been necessary, justified, and long overdue. The sins that needed absolution belonged to those who had enabled the Whitmore's crimes through their silence and complicity. When asked if she had any final words, she spoke in Spanish first, addressing the survivors in the crowd with a message that justice was possible, even when it came at the ultimate price. Then she switched to English for the benefit of the territorial officials and newspaper reporters who would carry her story across the continent, telling them that her death would not end the pursuit of justice for the murdered innocents who still demanded retribution from their graves. The smile never left her face as the trapdoor opened beneath her feet, not even as the rope tightened around her neck and the desert sky began to fade to black. Her last conscious thought was of her family waiting for her in whatever realm existed beyond death, and of the satisfaction of knowing that their murderers had preceded her into that darkness to face whatever judgment awaited those who had chosen profit over humanity. The crowd maintained respectful silence as her body swayed in the morning breeze, but as the territorial officials began to disperse, a low chanting began among the Mexican survivors that gradually spread to include voices in a dozen languages and dialects. They were singing an old song about justice delayed but never denied, about the price that must eventually be paid for innocent blood, about the way the desert wind carries the voices of the dead until their demands for retribution finally reach the ears of those capable of answering them. Her body was buried that afternoon in the same cemetery where her victims lay, moldering in expensive coffins, but her grave attracted more visitors than theirs ever would. Flowers appeared daily on the simple wooden cross that marked her resting place, left by people who traveled hundreds of miles to pay respect to someone who had accomplished what their own governments had been unwilling to attempt. The territorial investigation her trial had sparked eventually led to dozens of arrests and the exposure of corruption networks that stretched from Texas to Mexico City. But those victories came too late to save her life. The Whitmore ranch was abandoned within a month of the trial, its buildings left to the wind and weather that gradually erased all evidence of the family that had once called it home. Cattle wandered loose across lands that had been purchased with blood money, and local settlers helped themselves to livestock and equipment that no longer had legal owners. Within a year, nature had begun to reclaim the structures where so much evil had been planned and executed, covering them with sand and thorny vegetation that made the site appear cursed to travelers who happened upon it. But the story of Delilah Morales lived on in the songs and stories of the borderlands, told around campfires and in cantinas wherever people gathered to speak of justice and revenge. She became a figure of legend, proof that even the most powerless could find ways to balance the scales when institutions failed and powerful men thought themselves above consequences. Her smile in the face of death became a symbol of courage for those who faced their own impossible odds, and her name was invoked whenever people needed to remember that evil actions eventually demanded payment, no matter how long delayed or how carefully hidden. The territorial prosecutor who had demanded her death was arrested 6 months later on corruption charges stemming from evidence found in Thomas Whitmore's files, and he died in prison before his own trial could be completed. Judge Harrison was elevated to the Territorial Supreme Court, where he spent the remainder of his career fighting the same corruption he had helped expose in her case. And in the hills overlooking the ruins of the Whitmore Ranch, visitors still reported seeing a figure in a simple dress walking among the graves at sunset, smiling as she tended flowers that bloomed impossibly in the desert soil. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to hear more stories of justice from the Old West, where the strong preyed on the weak until someone finally made them pay the price. Like this video if you believe that sometimes the law isn't enough and some debts can only be settled with blood.